the overwhelming bit of advice is as you deploy AI and agentic AI, generative AI, the consensus seems to be that you do that in a way that has a great deal of human oversight, you know, and I I think that this is right, but it's right with an asterisk.
Welcome to another episode of Deep Learning with PolyAI. Today, I've got Brian Thompson, our VP of Product Marketing, here with me to talk about financial services and the work that not so much we are doing in banking and insurance, but in general trends and the state of AI within that whole ecosystem. So, Brian, what's happening with AI in the banks?
What's happened? Great question. Very broad. Look, so I've actually spent a lot of time in my career in various various areas of like the FinTech and working closely with everything from major banks to challenger banks and so on and so forth. And so I've had the chance to see things evolve over time. Right now, we're in this period of not backlash against AI hype, but people are trying to think in really practical terms about how do we get meaningful value out of deploying AI and how do we do it in a way that scales effectively and is, at the end of the day, very safe. And so this comes down to optimizing back office processes, data analysis, those types of things. That's the principal areas of inquiry, but also at the same time, things are very much in exploration mode. It's POCs more so than major transformative initiatives.
Yeah. I mean, like, I've always liked banks and kind of like the work we did with them, not because it's easy, but because it moves fairly predictably. And I think that while the requirements and the onus are, I think the number of hours we put in terms of answering infrastructure questionnaires and ensuring regulatory compliance is probably the highest in the industry we work with. It is an area where, CIOs are very commercially oriented and kind of like when decisions are made that they tend to kind of like flow in a very organized way. What are we seeing with agentic applications in banking? You mentioned the back office, but is there anything else happening?
Yeah. So again, I think I hate to say because it's not that there's a solution in search of a problem, but I think most of the excitement really does come around when you think about the amazing amount of data that exists, especially in like a large global bank, and the oftentimes disaggregated backend systems where various bits and pieces are housed. There's a lot of excitement about using agentic AI to pull things together and to analyze vast troves of data and to get meaningful, actionable insights. Of course, there's all the work that's been done with robo advising and things like that. There's kind of an extension of that now that people are talking about can we go a little more one-to-one with agents and that sort of thing. And long tail of, again, process optimization and this and that. And that's like kind of the story, particularly of the more venerable banks, is that it's this long tail of moving things from manual processes to increasingly automated ones. And agentic AI lends itself to that if it's, handled correctly.
Okay. I mean, how do you see like, the whole difference between like the very large bank and the kind of like wider set of, kind of like credit unions, community banks?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, like I said, one of the major issues that legacy banks face, scope and scale. Of course, they're just huge, and that introduces a lot of really meaningful challenges. Additionally, because so many core banking systems are built on legacy mainframes and other things like that, there's much more of a natural build culture because there has to have been a natural build culture. So, because you need to make a lot of very, very modern systems work with things that are, really suited for purpose for what they do, essentially, but are kind of long in the tooth and maybe not the best citizens of those larger ecosystems. And so just handling those challenges is very much a top priority for the large organizations. Now, you see versions of that, like as you scale down into regional banks and credit unions, but nowhere near to the same degree. It's easier to wrap your arms around that problem, just because you're dealing with fewer customers, and maybe you have a smaller portfolio of product offerings, that kind of thing. At the same time, however, there's, I think, a real opportunity, or a real desire for those regional banks to differentiate more effectively. And so you start to see, like, maybe agentic AI is not necessarily going to change the world with massive data analysis or improving processes for thousands of employees that don't exist. But they're thinking about it more in terms of, how can I use this in a ruthlessly competitive industry? How can I use this to win more customers from our larger competitors, offer a service that is more engaging, more personalized in some capacity? And so I think that that's more the direction of thinking as you get smaller and more challenger oriented.
Yeah, I mean, I always found it fascinating. I mean, all our two main markets. When you look at the US, the long tail of banks and credit unions, I think there's like 4,000 different entities that would kind of like classify as one shape or form of a bank, right? You compare that to the UK, where you've probably got like sub 10, right? Actual banks, including like the building societies and stuff, maybe you've got up to 20, but it's a real different Australia. I think you call it 4 or 5 banks. That's it, right? Um, it's really interesting because I think both with the larger American banks and with the Europeans, there is a real appetite for the best of breed solution because of that scale. Everything delivers a huge ROI, right? If you've got a contact center with a few thousand people, if you've got a multinational one with different languages, it kind of like creates human inefficiencies that AI doesn't suffer from because it's on demand. But it's also been, I think, a space which like, has historically lent itself in conversational AI to vertical specific players because there's just a big market where serving them and understanding their pains and needs has been enough for people to kind of get to a relatively small scale, kind of like Series A, B. We've not really seen any of those players come to dominate the market or really emerge as the more horizontal solutions. And I can't help but wonder if it might be that full like regulatory burden and the fact that they're slower that stops them from kind of like competing act. So for us, we really kind of like have more of a kind of like GM model where then there are vertical specific deployment teams and things, but the platform is horizontal. It's how do you think about all this and like in general this build versus buy? Because you mentioned that you know they do a lot of builds. I mean they do, but I will not classify them as build heavy as a telco. I think telcos are like the most extreme form of kind of like they're tech companies by evolution, right? So they really kind of like aim to build and to engage that muscle. They just have to work that muscle because they have it, right? I think with banks, you find a willingness to rely on services and GSIs on others, but how's that changing with the new generation?
Well, yeah, and I mean, covered a lot of ground there, but of course, the closer you get to anything that brushes up against a regulatory concern, like that increases the desire to own it end to end, and to have like total transparency, and so on and so forth. But actually, stepping back a little bit here, because you asked about vertical specific players and what we've seen, and I think it's because of the intense regulatory scrutiny that exists, even for the smallest financial institutions. Um, of course, people are they're gun shy a little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of trepidation around AI, and it's not really unwarranted. And so what ends up happening, of course, is how do you build that trust? Well, some of these smaller brands can go in and they say, well, okay, this solution is built just for you. And we really understand your problem space, to whatever degree. And that will hopefully, I think that's part of their strategy of getting past that first hurdle. Now, unfortunately, knowing the problem space or knowing the specifics of, regional bank regulations, it's a nice to have. It's incredibly useful. But in terms of deploying like AI technology, in particular agentic AI technology that actually delivers a measurable positive outcome, you need more than that. You need much more sophistication in the tech. And I think, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, because we have very explicitly taken on a horizontal approach with, as you say, GMs. And I think that's because, we want to understand problems, we want to understand our customers, but I think we also have this sense of the core problems we solve are like conversation and AI performance and, significant scale deployments. But like, what have you seen there? I like the
Yeah,
perimeter.
I mean, yeah, the in FS, right? The problems are, there are some call types that exist everywhere, even like cross country, where people call and ask for help setting up Apple Pay. And I think there was a change a few years ago, which just meant that you kind of have to re-enter the details of every card when you get a new phone. And trust me, like 10% of most contact centers deal with like retail banking have people calling in and just being asked, taken through that process. Now, they have choices around, will they actually stay on the phone with them to help out, guide them through, or is it like you can go online, or here's a link, or it really almost depends on the agent and their personal decision around how they feel that day and will they actually kind of like persevere through. But those are simple things. Then you go into kind of like the higher, if you're blocking a card, if you're activating a card, if you're transferring money, especially if you're adding new pays, it tends to be the kind of thing where you really have to kind of build, well, kind of like get approval from InfoSec where it is sensitive, right? And weirdly, there are a lot of people who still call to do these things. They don't do it on the phone, even though most banks, especially the bigger ones everywhere, right, have invested a lot of money into their apps, digital self-service. There's still an unbelievable number of people who do phone banking, who call to, check the balance, to a statement. Then you'll have questions, like payments, outgoing payments, or payments have been received. So there's a lot there. I think that for us, spiritually, really, it's always been about building the best thing for any vertical, right? And there's a layer of kind of like agent, right, that is agnostic to the vertical. But the more data you have, the better the speech recognition gets, the more sense you have in the platform to build out templates and use cases for these different things. So, we can pretty much get like a bank up and running in a month with almost everything, if we are to kind of like magically have all InfoSec done in advance. But we're seeing a lot of momentum there. We're seeing momentum with a lot of kind of like tier one FinTech, very large companies, have actually gone full circle in their build versus buy. They were always on the build side of the spectrum compared to, say, more traditional banks. We now see them coming back to us to co-create. And I think, to me, phase one of Poly was always very much about, let's prove to the world that we can build 10, 20, 30 outstanding voice agents. Because to most people, when I ask them even today, like, hey, like, what's the best voice agent experience you've had? It's just blank stares into this, right? Because they haven't had experiences. So to me, phase one was always build managed services companies, mostly with weaker IT, those that don't want to build, right? But where we're now seeing huge success is with companies that do want to build, but realize that your off-the-shelf Google thing or Amazon thing does not have what it takes for them to build something that would be worthy of a tier one financial institutions. So that's really, really encouraging. Now, of course, I think that data privacy, residence, there are a lot of things in FS that just make it that bit harder for them to have the latest thing, right? They might have requirements about data not leaving the EU or even a specific country or the US. For the US, it tends to be easier because a lot of the sub-processors, at least, will be in the US. And in general, the US is a bit easier with all of these things, although in some sense and with some FS-related things, it can be harder. I think in the EU, you have DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which has recently just, I think, basically 2x the amount of paperwork you have to fill as a vendor whenever you do anything. So yeah, there's just like, I think it's harder for a startup to embark upon that unless it's really choosing to do it. FS is like my one true love of kind of like of our verticals, and we persevered and we won, big global systemic banks. We won top 3 American insurers, some other really exciting things that I can't talk about yet. It's taken a bit of time for it to move, but I do like that when they move very systematically, and in a very organized way, so that if you get them to move, do the whole work of onboarding another vendor, then they're all in, and then they do a lot, and they tend to work really, really quickly. And I found that the bigger the bank, while you won't get any kind of like sudden overnight successes, the long-term implementation of a very complicated project tends to work better with a larger bank than it does with, because they've got the budgets, they've got that certainty, they're an institution. And I love that.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, they've got the budgets, the certainty, the institution. They have executional experience, and what I wanted to touch on is they have real significant motivation to do this, because there's when you think broadly about FinServe, whether it's legacy banks, challengers, fintechs, all of the different stakeholders there. We've spoken about regulations as a constraint for implementing technology, but regulations and other just sort of brute on the ground realities are also, they kind of limit what you're able to offer. Like the interest rate is the interest rate broadly, and so they're looking for ways to differentiate, and they're looking for ways to differentiate where customers are less loyal than they've ever been. Their expectations are much higher than they've ever been because they're being rightly or wrongly conditioned by other people in the space. And so you have they're staring down the barrel of, well, okay, we can bleed ourselves white offering incentives to try to get people to come on board, or we can treat our overall experience as a product itself. And being able to deploy really effective AI that's responsive and engaging, and even in your examples, there are so many use cases that really are, I think they're better if they're automated. I mean, sure, I can talk to a person and try to cancel my card, but I would rather be able to do that 24/7 automatically, pick up the phone whenever. And I think that there are plenty of those things that exist throughout these really complex, nonlinear life cycles that you have interacting with large bank, small bank, fintech, doesn't even really matter.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that like how would you say that the customer expectations are changing with AI?
So this is really it's a confluence of two things. Now we've said this forever. It's trite, but it's true. It's that, between Amazon and Apple and Google, like folks have just been conditioned to demand a lot. And they want things to be more connected. I want, click this and oh, my ID works and so on and so forth. So that's one element, and that's been going for a while. But the new thing that AI introduces is again another level of muddiness, where you've I think misinformation and misunderstanding is really high out there. And we see this a lot. There's this general sense of like, okay, ChatGPT can write a solid C plus B minus term paper, so clearly AI can do everything automatically. And folks don't necessarily understand, everything that goes into like having a system that is really performant and works in a business capacity. And I think the solution there is not to educate people out of it, because you can't. The solution is just to really, lean in and focus on like high value, deployments of AI where it makes the most sense and where it can have like the greatest impact in the customer's experience, because they will see that will register and that will tick those boxes. And they're like, yeah, this is different. This is not like what I got down the road. Or at the credit union or with whatever app.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing which again favors larger institutions that can mobilize to do this thing over the long haul. There are some examples from the past that are a bit murkier ROIs. For example, Erica is Bank of America's kind of like assistant. It's using their branding. I think there are tens and tens and tens of millions, if not more, that were spent on it. People, whenever I ask people, okay, what's a decent voice agent experience you've had, people probably mention this one as an experience they've had. They don't really call it good, right? it is something that's had a lot of money we poured into it. Yeah. And, there are large insurers as well to deploy something. There are some that are doing it with us right now. And I think it will improve. I think, one thing maybe to look at is just general insurance versus banking. Like, what are we seeing in insurance?
Yeah. Insurance? Insurance is interesting. So, uh, especially because when you're thinking about qualifying for something or an application, all that, you almost think of the application process as a kind of a considered purchase or an extended funnel.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things where people fall out of that funnel, or and you want potentially to bring them back. Or let's say you want to have a layer of qualification before someone gets to a human, because humans are kind of expensive if they're taking people's information over the phone. And so of course there are implications for experience on the insurance side, where people can have callers can have a better time just giving their info. But I think more broadly, there's the opportunity, and we've already done this a little bit, is to just change the underlying unit economics of insurance qualification, and that has massive transformational implications well beyond what you'd expect.
Yeah, yeah. Increase the leverage of the business at first. Okay. What else does the audience need to know about FS?
Okay, most most important thing that I have neglected to mention here, and this comes down to all of your best practices that you're going to get, where you see the blogs and the think pieces and all of that. The overwhelming bit of advice is, as you deploy AI and agentic AI, generative AI, the consensus seems to be that you do that in a way that has a great deal of human oversight, you know, and I think that this is right, but it's right with an asterisk, because I think that usually the way what's being proposed is have AI handle something and then have a human review every single individual interaction, approve it or not. And that, if you do that wrong, it ends up like take your kid to work day. You're spending a lot of extra time and you're not necessarily realizing efficiencies. And so when you think about how to insert humans into that process of review and quality control and improving like the overall state of whatever your AI deployment is, like that's a platform level question that you need to be asking to people. And you need to think about, your strategies for collaborating, of course, internally within your bank, but your strategies also for collaborating with AI agents and with your vendors who are deploying those. And so it's a more complicated problem, but if you solve it effectively, you can get a lot more return on investment much quicker.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think at that point we're fairly out of time. It was a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for sharing these insights, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks a lot.